It's been a few months now, and I still catch myself thinking about it whenever I'm driving alone at night. Not constantly, not in some dramatic way, but every now and then it just creeps back into my head for no reason. Usually when the road is empty and the trees are too close to the shoulder. At the time, I was doing general repair work, mostly carpentry, minor electrical jobs, fixing up cabins and old properties for people who either rented them out or only visited a few times a year. The pay was decent, and honestly, I liked the isolation of it. No boss watching over my shoulder, no co-workers making small talk all day. Just me, my tools, and whatever needed fixing. That particular job was deep out in a wooded area, about an hour and a half from where I lived. The kind of place where your phone loses signal for miles at a time. And if something goes wrong, you better hope somebody happens to drive by eventually. The cabin belonged to a hunter who only used it during the season, so it had been sitting empty for months. Leaky roof, cracked window frame, warped floorboards. Nothing unusual. I'd been working since early morning, and by the time I packed up, the sun was already starting to dip behind the trees. I actually remember standing there for a minute debating whether I should just stay the night. Technically, I could have. The cabin wasn't comfortable, but it was usable. Something about the thought of driving back through those woods after dark bothered me more than I wanted to admit. At the time, I told myself I was just tired, so I ignored the feeling. I loaded my tools into the truck and started heading out. The road was barely even a road, honestly. More like a narrow dirt trail carved through dense forest. Two vehicles couldn't pass each other unless one of them backed into a clearing, and even those were rare. I'd driven it earlier that morning, so none of it surprised me then. But once the daylight started fading, the whole place changed. Forests get quiet in a way that feels unnatural when the sun goes down, like everything is listening. I had the radio playing low. I remember feeling sore, exhausted, already thinking about getting home, taking a shower, eating real food instead of gas station junk. Nothing felt wrong yet. Then I saw headlights ahead of me. That immediately caught my attention because I hadn't seen another vehicle all day. Not on the drive in, not while I was working, nothing. So seeing headlights suddenly appear around the bend made my stomach tighten a little, before I even understood why. As the vehicle got closer, it slowed almost to a crawl. At first, I assumed they were just being careful because of how narrow the trail was. But something about it felt hesitant, like they weren't sure about me either. Eventually, we both stopped facing each other, maybe 20 or 30 feet apart. I remember thinking, okay, normal situation. One of us backs up, problem solved. I had passed a small clearing maybe a minute earlier, so I figured I'd reverse back to it. I rolled my window down halfway and leaned out, motioning with my hand like, I'll back up. Before I could even put the truck in reverse, both doors of the other vehicle opened. Two men stepped out. And the second I saw them, something in me shifted. I can't explain it properly without sounding paranoid. But there are moments where your brain notices things before you consciously do. Little details stacking together faster than logic can keep up with them. That's what this felt like. The first thing I noticed was their clothing. It didn't fit the environment at all. Long, dark garments that hung loosely off them, almost robe-like, but not in a religious way, I recognized. They looked strangely outdated, like costumes from some low-budget documentary about isolated cults. The fabric moved oddly when they walked, stiff in some places, dragging in others. Neither of them spoke. They just started walking toward my truck in complete silence. At first, I stayed calm, I honestly tried to rationalize it. Maybe they needed help. Maybe their car was stuck farther back. Maybe they were just weird guys living out there. But the closer they got, the more wrong it felt. Not threatening exactly. Worse than that. Intentional. Their pace never changed. Slow, steady, direct. And neither one of them looked around, even once. They were focused entirely on me. I remember this horrible feeling creeping into my chest that they already knew I was alone out there. Like they'd known before they even stopped the car. One of them tilted his head slightly while staring through my windshield. Not at me, at the inside of the truck, like he was checking who else might be there. That was the moment I realized I hadn't seen the driver anymore. Only the two men walking toward me. And for some reason, that terrified me more than anything else. It happened when I was around 19, back when I still lived with my parents in a rural area where nothing unusual ever seemed to happen. That's honestly part of why it stayed with me so much. When you grow up somewhere quiet, you stop expecting danger. Life settles into routines so predictable that even small disruptions stand out. Most days in our area felt exactly the same as the day before. Long stretches of silence, distant traffic every now and then, the occasional dog barking somewhere down the road. My name's Sophia, and back then my life was pretty simple. I worked part-time, saved whatever money I could, and spent most of my time trying to figure out what I actually wanted to do with my future. Nothing dramatic. Just that awkward stage where you feel like adulthood is approaching faster than you're ready for. Most days followed the same rhythm. Wake up early, help around the house, drive to work, come home tired, repeat. My parents both worked too, but their schedules rarely lined up. My dad was usually gone during the day, and my mom sometimes worked late shifts, so it wasn't unusual for me to spend a few hours alone at the house. That day felt completely ordinary. It was sometime in the afternoon, not even dark yet. I'd just gotten home from work, changed into comfortable clothes, and wandered into the kitchen to make something small to eat. I remember being tired in that normal, automatic way where you're moving through routines without really thinking about them. Then I heard a knock at the front door. People stopped by occasionally out there. Neighbors sometimes. Delivery drivers getting lost. Random people asking for directions because the roads in our area weren't marked very well. So I didn't think much of it. If anything, I remember being mildly annoyed because I'd only just gotten home and wanted to relax. I opened the door and saw two men standing there. I didn't recognize either of them. At first, nothing about them was obviously wrong. They weren't dressed strangely. No masks, no aggressive behavior, nothing dramatic like that. Just normal clothes. But something immediately felt off. Even now, I struggle to explain exactly what caused that feeling. Maybe it was the way they stood too still. Maybe it was how neither of them smiled. Or maybe it was the sense that they weren't really there to ask a question at all. One of them asked me about a farm nearby. He mentioned a name I didn't recognize. I told him honestly that I had no idea what place he was talking about. That should have ended the interaction. And technically, it did. They didn't argue, didn't push for more information. One of them just nodded slightly and said something like, "All right then." But the part I still remember clearly happened right before they turned away. Both of them looked past me into the house. Not casually either. It was deliberate, slow, like they were checking something. I remember feeling this tiny shift in my stomach immediately. This quiet instinct that something about that look wasn't normal. But at the same time, I kept rationalizing it. People are curious. That's all. I closed the door, locked it, and went back inside. But instead of returning to the kitchen right away, I just stood there in the hallway listening. I still don't know what I expected to hear. Footsteps, maybe. Voices. Something. After a minute or two, I went to the front window and peeked outside. I saw them walking down the road, away from the house. Neither of them looked back, at least not while I was watching. Later that evening, when my parents got home, I mentioned it casually over dinner. I didn't present it like a serious thing. Just said 2 guys had stopped by asking about some farm I'd never heard of. My dad asked what they looked like. But even that felt more conversational than concerned. At the time, none of us treated it like a warning sign. Looking back now, though, I think that was the first moment something started. Not the conversation itself, the way they looked inside. Like they weren't interested in directions. Like they were checking who lived there. A few nights later, something else happened. I slept through it completely, but my dad told me the next morning while we were having coffee. He said he'd gone outside late that night to check something near the driveway and noticed a car parked near the road. That alone was unusual. We almost never had random cars stopping out there, especially that late. He said he called out a simple "hello" toward the road, and the second he did, the car started immediately and sped off. He didn't chase it or anything, but I remember the way he talked about it afterward. My dad wasn't someone who got nervous easily, but there was this slight hesitation in his voice when he said it didn't feel right. That phrase stuck with me, because deep down, I think all of us had started feeling it by then. That uncomfortable sense that something had shifted around the house without us fully understanding what it was yet. I remember my dad mentioning the car in that same calm tone he used for almost everything. But there was something underneath it. A slight edge. Like he was thinking harder about the situation than he wanted to admit out loud. At the time, I did think briefly about the 2 men who had come to the door earlier that week. The thought crossed my mind immediately, but I didn't fully connect it. Not really. It felt more like one of those uneasy little coincidences your brain notices before logic steps in and dismisses it. And honestly, that's the part that bothers me now. How easy it was to explain everything away. Because when strange things happen gradually, you normalize them piece by piece. Nothing feels serious enough on its own. You keep waiting for an obvious moment where danger finally announces itself clearly. Real life usually doesn't work that way. About a week later, I was home alone again. It was late afternoon, maybe early evening. Not dark yet, but the weather was overcast enough that the inside of the house already felt dim and gray. I remember the atmosphere of that day so vividly because everything felt unusually still. I was lying on my bed doing absolutely nothing important, just scrolling on my phone and half thinking about work the next morning. Then I heard a sound that immediately felt wrong. A dull thud, not loud enough to be dramatic, but heavy, solid, like pressure against wood. At first, I thought maybe something had fallen outside or one of the storage bins had tipped over in the wind. But then I heard it again, stronger this time. I got up and stepped into the hallway trying to figure out where it was coming from. That's when I realized it was coming from the back of the house. There was this horrible scraping, straining sound, the noise of something being forced that wasn't supposed to move. I remember stopping halfway down the hallway instead of continuing forward. Instinct. Something inside me already knew. Then came the crack, sharp, distinct, the unmistakable sound of wood splitting apart. And suddenly, every part of me understood what was happening at once. The back door burst inward slightly, not fully at first, just enough for me to see movement behind it. I still remember the exact feeling that hit me in that moment because it honestly didn't feel real. It was like my brain rejected the image before finally accepting it. It was the same two men. Even with the panic, even with everything happening fast, I recognized them instantly. And somehow that made it so much worse. Because it meant this wasn't random. They remembered the house. They remembered me. The first visit had meant something. I turned to run. I barely made it a few steps before one of them grabbed me from behind. I can still remember stupid details from that moment more clearly than the important ones. The roughness of his sleeve, the stale smell coming off his clothes, the sound of my own breathing suddenly becoming loud in my ears. People imagine adrenaline makes everything sharp and heroic. But for me, it felt fragmented. Like my mind was grabbing random pieces of reality while everything else blurred together. What became clear almost immediately was that they were trying to drag me toward the back door. Not frantically, not chaotically. That's what terrified me most. They seemed controlled, purposeful, like this was something they had already discussed before coming there. Then one of them suddenly said something, calmly, almost impatiently. "Let's do it here." I still hear that sentence sometimes. The other man immediately snapped back, more tense this time. "No, take her." And just like that, the energy between them changed. They started arguing while still holding on to me, pulling slightly in different directions. Their movements stopped being coordinated. What had felt planned seconds earlier suddenly felt unstable and unpredictable. For this brief moment, it was like their focus shifted away from me and onto each other. Then it turned physical. One shoved the other shoved back harder. It only lasted seconds. But in moments like that, seconds feel enormous. Their grip loosened. I stumbled sideways hard enough to nearly fall. And then suddenly, neither of them was paying attention to me anymore. One of them slammed the other against the wall near the kitchen entrance. And something about that moment seemed to snap both of them back to reality at the same time. Without another word, they ran. Straight out the broken back door the same way they came in. And then the house went silent. Completely silent. I remember standing there shaking so badly my knees felt weak. But at the same time, everything else inside me felt numb. Like my body had overloaded and shut certain emotions off temporarily just to keep functioning. I grabbed my phone and called the police, then my parents. I don't even remember exactly what I said during the call. I was crying so hard at one point that the operator had to keep asking me to repeat things. By the time police arrived, the men were gone. The only evidence left was the broken door hanging crooked on its frame and the mess they'd made forcing their way inside. I explained everything as best I could. The two men, the earlier visit, the car near the road, all of it. They never found them. No names, no arrests, nothing. Later, one of the officers told us they believed the first visit had likely been deliberate, that the men were probably checking who lived there, whether I was alone during the day, how isolated the house was. Hearing that made me feel sick in a completely different way. Because suddenly all those small moments I dismissed no longer felt harmless. They felt calculated. After that, things changed in ways that are difficult to explain unless you've lived through something like it. I couldn't stay home alone without feeling tense. Every unfamiliar sound became a possibility. Every knock at the door made my stomach drop. I started checking locks constantly without even realizing I was doing it. Sometimes I'd check the same lock 3 or 4 times in a row because the fear never fully settled after the first check. And years later, parts of it still come back unexpectedly. A car slowing down outside at night. A knock I'm not expecting. Footsteps near the house. It all pulls me right back into that hallway for a split second before my brain catches up and reminds me I'm safe. But the thing that stays with me most is knowing how close it came. I truly don't think I would have gotten away if they hadn't turned on each other, even briefly. That realization changes something in you permanently. Because afterward, you stop seeing safety as something guaranteed. You start understanding how quickly ordinary life can break apart without warning. My name's Charlotte. I was 28 at the time, or close to it. And I'd moved out there because I thought I needed some kind of reset. At that point in my life, everything felt stuck in this repetitive cycle that I couldn't seem to break out of. I'd been working at a small clothing shop in town for a few years, folding shirts, helping customers, pretending I had some long-term plan figured out. Meanwhile, I kept obsessing over this idea of starting an online shop selling altered thrift clothes and custom pieces. I wasn't making real money from it yet, but in my head, it was always almost becoming something. I convinced myself what I needed was the right environment. Somewhere quieter, somewhere I could focus. So I rented this small, single-story house in a semi-rural area about 20 minutes outside town. It wasn't isolated exactly, but it felt separated from everything. There were a few scattered houses nearby, though not close enough to create that normal neighborhood feeling. At night, you couldn't hear people talking or cars passing. Just wind, insects, and sometimes nothing at all. The house itself wasn't special. Cheap rent, old floors, a backyard lined with trees. But at the time, affordable mattered more than comfortable. I settled into a routine pretty quickly. Work during the day, come home in the evening, eat something simple, then sit with my laptop for hours, trying to teach myself how online selling actually worked. Product photos, shipping labels, editing listings, all of it. And honestly, I think I liked the routine more than I admitted to myself. Because without it, the silence out there got to me sometimes, especially at night. There's a certain kind of quiet in rural areas that doesn't feel peaceful after a while. It starts feeling watchful, like the world outside your windows is holding its breath. I kept telling myself I was independent, that I enjoyed living alone. But looking back, I think I was trying to force confidence I didn't fully have yet. The house next to mine sat empty when I first moved in. Or at least I thought it did. I never saw lights on, never heard anyone outside. Then, maybe 2 or 3 weeks later, I noticed an old trailer parked there. After that, I started seeing movement around the property. At first, I didn't think much of it. People move in, people leave. It happens. But then I saw him, and I still struggle to explain exactly why he unsettled me so much, because it wasn't like he did anything openly threatening right away. It was subtler than that. Something about the way he carried himself felt wrong. Not physically deformed or anything dramatic, just unnatural in small ways. His posture always looked stiff, like he wasn't fully comfortable in his own body. And sometimes he would stand completely motionless for these strange stretches of time, not smoking, not using his phone, not doing anything, just standing there. The first time I noticed him clearly, he was near the edge of his yard, staring in my direction, not waving, not looking around casually, just watching. I remember immediately feeling uncomfortable, then almost getting annoyed at myself for reacting that strongly. When you move somewhere unfamiliar, your brain fills in gaps. Every stranger feels stranger than they probably are. That's what I told myself anyway. So I went back inside, made dinner, watched TV for a while, and tried to forget about it. Then the next day, I saw him again. Closer. After that, it became this quiet pattern I couldn't stop noticing. Sometimes he'd slowly walk circles around his property. Sometimes he'd stand near the trees behind the houses. And every now and then, I'd catch him lingering near the space between our yards, like he didn't fully recognize where his property ended and mine began. That was the part that slowly started getting under my skin. Not because he crossed over constantly, because he acted like boundaries genuinely didn't matter. The first time he actually stepped into my backyard, I remember feeling this immediate wave of discomfort that hit before I consciously understood why. I'd been outside hanging clothes to dry when I suddenly realized someone was behind me. I hadn't heard footsteps, no branches cracking, nothing. That silence is honestly the thing I remember most vividly. I turned around, and he was just there, standing a few steps inside my yard, not close enough to touch me, but close enough that he absolutely should have announced himself. Instead, he was staring down at the ground, like he was inspecting something buried in the grass. I asked, as calmly as I could, "Do you need something?" He didn't answer at first. He just tilted his head slightly, almost like he was trying to process the question itself rather than think of a response. Then he muttered something I couldn't fully understand. I can't remember the exact wording anymore, but it was something about keeping things clean or watching how things grow. And what bothered me wasn't even what he said. It was the feeling that he wasn't responding to me at all. It sounded like he was continuing a conversation that had already been happening somewhere inside his own head. I told him a little more firmly that it was my yard, and I'd appreciate it if he stayed on his side of the property. He just nodded once. Then he turned and walked away. And even that felt wrong somehow, because the second he turned his back, it was like I stopped existing to him entirely. No awkward apology, no glance back, nothing. One moment, all of his attention was fixed on me, and the next it was like a switch had flipped off inside him. After that, it kept happening. Not constantly, just enough that I started anticipating it. I'd catch movement outside my window and see him lingering near the fence line. Sometimes he'd already be standing partially inside the yard before I noticed him. Every single time I confronted him, he'd leave without arguing, but always with those same disconnected comments that never quite matched the situation. Things about plants, cleanliness, growth. Once he muttered something about spaces changing when people sleep. That one stayed with me longer than I wanted it to. I remember constantly trying to rationalize it, because technically, he wasn't doing anything openly aggressive. He wasn't threatening me. He wasn't damaging anything. And that made the whole situation harder to explain, even to myself. I kept thinking, what exactly would I even report? My neighbor stands in my yard and says weird things. It sounded ridiculous the second I imagined saying it out loud. So instead, I downplayed it. I think a lot of people do that when something feels wrong but hasn't crossed a clear enough line yet. You keep waiting for a moment where you can finally justify being afraid. Looking back, I think part of me already was. There was one afternoon that stands out now because it felt different, even though at the time I couldn't fully explain why. He came to my front door. That alone immediately unsettled me because he'd never approached the house directly before. I was sitting on my bed, working on product listings when I heard a knock. Not loud, just 3 soft taps against the wood. I opened the door and found him standing there, closer than I'd ever seen him before. Up close, things about him felt even more unsettling. His clothes looked heavily worn, but not in a normal, worked outside all day kind of way. The fabric was stained and stretched oddly, like it had been used for things clothes weren't meant for. His fingernails were dirty. His skin looked pale in a way that almost seemed unhealthy. And his expression, that was the hardest part to read. It wasn't anger. It wasn't friendliness either. It was almost blank, except for something in his eyes that felt intensely focused, like he was studying me while pretending not to. Then he asked if I needed someone to clean my backyard. And weirdly, for half a second, I actually felt relieved. Because it was the first thing he'd ever said that sounded remotely normal. But the feeling disappeared almost immediately once I remembered every other interaction we'd had. I told him no, everything was fine. I tried to keep my voice polite but short, the way women instinctively do when they're trying not to escalate a situation. He just stood there, too long, not speaking, not leaving, just standing in the doorway, looking past me into the house like he was memorizing it. Then finally he nodded once and walked away. Again, that same abrupt disconnect. No transition, like somebody cutting power to a machine. That night, I remember checking the locks twice before bed. I told myself I was only being cautious. But the truth is, there was already this constant low-level fear sitting in the back of my mind by then. The kind that follows you from room to room, even when you're trying to ignore it. About a week later, everything happened. And even now, trying to replay it step by step feels difficult because parts of it still don't feel real in my memory. Not blurry exactly. More like my brain keeps resisting the reality of it. It was late at night. I'd already brushed my teeth, changed clothes, turned off most of the lights. I was sitting on the edge of my bed doing that last mental checklist people do before sleeping. Phone charging, front door locked, kitchen light off. I remember thinking I should do one final check of the house before bed. Something I'd started doing regularly after he began showing up around the property. So I opened my bedroom door and immediately saw someone standing in the hallway. Close enough that if I'd taken one more step forward, I would have walked directly into him. For a second, my brain genuinely refused to process what I was seeing.